Let's work through the morning blossoms pattern together. At this point, you have set up your embroidery hoop, you understand the basic principles and how-tos of punch needle embroidery, and familiarized yourself with the pattern. If you are not comfortable with any of these steps, come back to this video after you have watched our other video tutorials covering the basics, links down below. Since we are starting with a lighter colored yarn, I suggest first threading your punch needle with the navy yarn to clean out any of the residue inside of the punch needle shaft. If threading a punch needle is new to you, take a minute to walk through our quick tutorial. Now, let's thread the punch needle with the yellow yarn. Now we're ready to start the pattern. We are going to begin with the top narrow stitch to complete the center of the daisy, as well as the two white centers of the morning glories. Using the pointed tip of the punch needle, punch the fabric at the center of the circle as far as your needle will go. Pull the tail of the yarn through, leaving a couple of inches on the back side of the fabric. Turn the project back over and pull the punch needle out of the hole you just made. With the tip of the needle still touching the monk's cloth, draw the needle forward about 2 squares. Once again, punch the fabric. Now before pulling it back up, rotate it to point in the direction of your next stitch. Draw the tip of the needle forward about 2 squares and punch again. Continue this sequence, punching short, tight stitches in a circle around the first stitch you created. Continue filling the daisy center with stitches. Place each new stitch as closely as possible to the stitch from the previous round. When you are completing your last stitch, do not pull the needle back through the fabric. Flip the project over, pull the yarn through the punch needle shaft, and cut the yarn with your scissors. Now pull the punch needle back through the fabric. Next, we are going to complete the 2 white centers of the morning glories. The flower with the complete circle will be filled in exactly the same way as the yellow daisy center. The morning glory that has only half of the circle will still be completed in the same manner. The only difference is that rather than working in a circular motion, we are going to be working back and forth in rows. Work stitches along the edge of the pattern, then turn your needle, or your work, whichever is easier for you, to work the next row. Once you finish this small section, trim the yarn and pull the punch needle back through and out of the fabric. You have now completed step 1 of the pattern. Let's move on to step 2. Next, we are going to complete the hydrangeas. First the blossoms using the needle wrap stitch, and then the stems using the faux chain stitch or variation. Poke the hole in the center of the circle. Bring the punch needle back up and then rotate the punch needle so that you create a loop. Turn your punch needle in a complete circle so that the needle is facing the same direction in which you started. This stitch is a little bit like twirling a fork with spaghetti on it. Pull the needle up a little bit this time because you are going to punch the next hole over the loop of the last stitch you made. You will also want to play with the amount of slack you use for each loop. You may want to hold on to the back of the yarn if your yarn has gotten a little frayed and doesn't glide through the needle as smoothly. Continue working the hydrangea from the center outward until you are ready to complete your last stitch. As you pull the punch needle back up to complete the previous stitch, do not turn the needle this time. Lift the needle over the last loop and complete a top narrow stitch to finish the flower and lock it into place. Once you have completed all 10 hydrangea blooms in this manner, you're ready for step 3. Next is the hydrangea stems. Each stem is completed using 2 rows. one row up and one row back down to the starting point. Start at the bottom of a branch and complete the basic top stitch. The top stitch is the same stitch as the top narrow stitch, but instead of punching every 2 holes in the monk's cloth, you're going to create longer stitches, punching about every 4 holes in the monk's cloth. Continue punching in the same direction until you reach a branch or the flower blossom. When I reach this branch, I simply work up to the blossom, turn my needle, and work back down to the main stem. Then I continue up to finish the next branch of this bloom. Continue up till you reach the blossom, turn your needle around, and work back down. To complete the faux chain stitch, we are going to aim to punch in the hole that we created on the last pass. We will work this final branch the same way, working our way up to the bloom and then turning around and trying to punch into the same stitch coming back down. Finish the branch by adding the last couple stitches so that you finish in the exact same place that you started. Now I'm going to show you a variation on a different way to do this branch. You start out the same way, punching at the base of the stem, and you work your way up the exact same way. Approximately every 4 holes, you poke a stitch. The main difference with this variation is rather than aiming to place each return stitch in the same hole, this time you are aiming for the middle of each stitch. It's a little harder to see on these shorter branches, but basically you are trying to alternate the stitch holes versus trying to line them up. So I make my way up to the blossom, I turn my needle around, and this time rather than aiming for the same hole, I'm going for the middle of each stitch. The difference is quite small, but I feel like this one looks a little bit more like a braid and the other one looks more like a chain. You decide which one you like better or use both. For step 4, we will complete the navy centers of the forget-me-nots with the satin stitch. We will punch a hole in the center of the smaller star and work each petal in long stitches up and back down to the center. The satin stitch is an elegant stitch that creates a smooth looking pattern. When working this stitch, return to the point of the last stitch as closely as you can so that each satin stitch is right next to the last one. After completing each petal with the satin stitch, return back to where you started and trim your yarn. Now we are ready for step 5. Complete each blossom of the morning glories, forget-me-nots, and daisy using the same satin stitch to create each petal. The primary difference between step 4 and step 5 is just the length of each stitch. Work the same up and down motion, keeping the stitches as close as possible. This is what creates the beautiful satin pattern. As you can see, I'm kind of working this daisy in a diagonal, back and forth motion. This creates a unique texture, and it also adds to the puffiness of each petal. Sometimes with these longer stitches, they can pop out pretty easily. It's okay to hold on to the yarn on the back side just to keep it in place while you're working the stitch. Now you just complete each petal of each flower in the same manner. Experiment with what you like and what you don't like with the satin stitch. Do you like the diagonal or the straight up and down? Now we are going to complete the forget-me-nots using the same satin stitch. The last flowers to add before starting the background are the navy morning glories. We will continue using the satin stitch to finish these flowers. The last piece to complete is the coral background. Working from the outside toward the center, use the top stitch to fill in the coral background and complete the pattern. On this particular pattern, I took a pen and divided the pattern up with 4 separate sections. Then I used the top stitch from the outside in on each of the 4 sections. When completing the background of a pattern, there really is no right or wrong way to do it. If you want to keep working around in circles until you hit a point where you have to work around a flower, then do that. Or if you want to do shorter sections, you can do that too. I think it's just important to find what you enjoy and what you find to be the most meditative way to complete the background. You may notice that I rotate my work just as much as I rotate my needle when changing directions. Try both methods and see which one works for you. I will say that rotating my work more than my punch needle does make stitches pop out a little more frequently. As you can see, I'm continuing to work the pattern in the 4 quadrants that I drew out before I got started on the background. While working these longer sections, it's okay to cut the yarn every once in a while. That way you don't have to backtrack too far if a stitch comes undone. That's it! You've completed the morning blossom pattern. I hope you enjoyed working through this pattern as much as I enjoyed creating it for you.